This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, any place. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. I'm your host with your other co-hosts today. We've got a full house.
It's Mathias fueling on deck, bringing in our man
Keith Riley.
How good it is to have everyone together in the Hour of History
It's the end
studio.
of semester. We're all feeling pretty pumped or like defeated. Either way, it's a relief to be close to the end. But today we're bringing you a very special topic, a topic on the minds of lots of people, which is that eternal clash of the Midwesterners and the East Coast elites, or the West Coast elites. Flyover country versus big city. The urban-rural divide. Globally. Yeah. Globally, nationally, but it's a thing. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
I'm sure most of our listeners probably live in a major metropolitan area. So this is the Trump vote. It's all there.
Yeah, so, where do we start with such a big topic? It's funny, we could start in the city and go out to the rural area, but I'd rather start in the rural areas.
Yeah.
Matthias, why don't you tell us about where you grew up?
Yeah, so I'm kind of representative, I think, in many ways of current demographic trends in America. I was born, so I'm from out west, the Intermountain West region. So I was born in southern Utah in a city called St. George. Until I was 11, I grew up in a tiny little town on the Arizona-Utah border called Fredonia, and it was about 1,000 people. Very tiny, very, very rural. Obviously, most everyone there was a farmer or involved in agriculture in some way. Most people were Mormon. We had to drive to a town across the border in Utah just to do grocery shopping or to do anything that comprised like having a human society. When I was kind of a young teenager, like 12, 13, I moved to a town in New Mexico called Grants. It was about like an hour and a half-ish directly west from Albuquerque. That was about 10,000 people. And I thought that was the bomb because it had like a theater with multiple screens and it had like cafes. And I thought this was amazing. And restaurants. I had never been in a place that had restaurants. And then from there, I moved to southern Idaho to Burley, another predominantly agricultural, highly Mormon, very conservative area. Also a town of about 10,000. And then from there, I moved to northern Utah, scaling up. I'm always like exponentially going upward to northern Utah, where I did my BA and my master's at Utah State University in this valley, Cache Valley, which has maybe tops 100,000 people. But that was like the big city because I was dealing with people that weren't like all white and Mormon, or Hispanic and Catholic, which was the two demographic groups I knew growing up. And then from there, I moved to Philadelphia. So we're scaling up big. Yeah. So I'm cutting across that divide from 1,000 people to what's in the Philly metro area, like 1.5 million ish.
At least, yeah. So it's interesting that you frame your sort of narrative that way, where like you're developing and you're like
next time I'm gonna move to like Mexico City, like always looking for the next tier.
Well,
upwards.
you're getting a new degree, a new job, and then you get a new city, and that's very sort of. It doesn't typically reverse. So, I got my degree and then I went to Burley, Idaho. It doesn't work that way usually. So, is that part? Well, Keith, is that part of the urban-rural divide? These narratives, these trajectories?
I don't know. I mean, I almost feel like the urban-rural divide, as we like talk about it, is like a farce.
Yes.
But
you just said.
I've been to Burley. I mean, first time I met Mathias, I was like, "Oh, you're from Burley?" Like, one time I was on a road trip and the car broke down in Burley and we were stuck there for like a couple days.
All roads lead to Burley.
Yeah, all roads lead to Burley. And it seemed like a nice place. Like it seemed like, right, it's one of these places like in the West that's undergoing like a big demographic shift or something, right? Because like there's like a big Hispanic influx in Burley, right? And like the sort of demographics are changing. I guess I grew up in the Bay Area, so like, and my cousins were like from Sacramento, and like talking to them in the present, they're always like, "Oh, we always thought you guys were like these cultured snobs because you guys grew up in the Bay Area, and we were like from like bumfuck Sacramento," and like that didn't even occur to me, but I guess it is like something that's in the mind. But
Sacramento's still like a big city.
It is. It's ridiculous, right? That was my problem with Lady Bird. It like portrays Sacramento like it's Burley or something, right?
Yeah, it's like Sacramento's like booming.
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous, right? But I mean, I think like the divide, right? The one event that's like really come up lately that I think like really kind of illustrates this, how the divide is kind of, a little bit played up, is like all these teachers strikes, right? Happening in like red states, right? Kentucky, Arizona, West Virginia, Oklahoma, right? And the idea we have of these places, right, is that it's Trump land. Like the kind of radicalism of those places has long since gone, right? But
what happened to Kansas?
Right? So like, I mean, but these people are still sort of, invested in unions, invested in workers' rights and stuff, much like the ways that we think about the politics of the big cities.
Well, see, it's interesting because
what about your background, Steve?
It's kind of interesting because Keith was one of the only people I've ever met, especially outside of California, who knew where I was from, Visalia. So, but I
know the Onion.
The Onion.
Isn't it
No, Vidalia is the onion.
God,
that's
damn
a different.
Okay,
is the potato or the onion, right?
Yeah.
Vidalia. No, Visalia is founded by Nathaniel Weiss, who also founds Visalia, Kentucky. So there's two Visalias.
Oh wow.
The one in California far more successful. But anyway, no one in Visalia would talk about Visalia as a successful city, despite the fact that it has over 100,000 people. So it's much bigger than a lot of these towns in the Midwest. And it was very interesting that Keith knew where it was from because it's on the map. It's not totally insignificant, but as far
it's no Burley, Idaho, or Fredonia.
I feel like Visalia is kind of similar to Burley in a lot of ways. Would you say?
I don't know Burley.
Okay. Well, Keith. I think there is truth to the urban-rural divide, but I do think it is, of course, every political party and grouping wants to like play it up for their own benefit, right?
Yeah.
Like obviously Trump voters, or like not Trump voters, that's kind of like a mythical category, but like Trump Politico people, right? Or want to say that like the rural area that predominantly voted for Trump, that's the real America. Those are like the original racial stock of America, which is always like, that's kind of the undercurrent, right? Is like these like yeoman farmers out in the rural areas are like the rough people, the tough people, like the people that are the self-dependent people, right? And then of course, certain terrible brands of like the liberal left are like, or I don't know if liberals are leftists anymore, but like the liberals, right, would say like, like all of these like people in flyover country, they're just a bunch of like yokels and hicks, and they're not from these big cities, so they're like kind of the great unwashed, they're uncultured, they're ignorant. We should not be focusing on them. They're like the past. We're moving into the future of this like beautiful cosmopolitan cityscape. Right. And both of those are like bullshit. False. Yeah, both of those are bullshit. Yeah.
But I'm kind of interested.
But there is a divide. There is a divide.
The people that are in the middle is what interests me. So the person you see this like with cities like New York and Los Angeles are overly populated with people who have left. Yeah. So theirs is more
exactly. Yeah.
To their parents or something, to what they grew up with, rather than an actual commentary on the actual situation, because we don't really talk about the sort of reverse. Like there's a lot of innovation and stuff going on in places.
The Midwest is booming right now.
Like to use Fresno as an example, they have a lot of like microbrews and things like that. There's culture there. Even Fresno's a huge city.
Yeah. It's a bad rap.
Sixth largest city in California.
Right.
But not in terms of like, people, the way that the narrative sort of is.
Yeah. Well, do you think that's like Oedipal, right? Is almost right, like all these people from rural areas move to big cities and then like look back on like where they came from and just say like,
that's so kind of what I'm saying.
Disgusting. Because I feel like that's something that like I saw this. I feel like on Twitter, and I'm going to reference Twitter a lot in this because I feel like Twitter is like the place you just like bottom out if you're always online.
As long as it's not Kanye Twitter,
it's like the crack cocaine of like onlineness. But I just remember after Trump got elected on Twitter, I was seeing all these like channels on my timeline talking about like, like we shouldn't like, this idea on a more economic left perspective that we need to like talk about like working class folks in the middle of nowhere who are being ravaged by like opioid epidemic and economic stuff and being destroyed by like all kinds of Republican legislation. Like, oh, we don't care about them almost because like they're super racist, and then also like this would be someone on Twitter saying like I myself am from this rural area and I got out and I moved to like a big city and look how successful I am. So it's like it's their fault that they're backwards there now. It's their fault that they're stuck, and so we shouldn't be like pandering to these people. Like their fault is their fault, and if you really were like some like enlightened progressive person, you would be able to get out. And so they would say like this urban rural divide is ridiculous because, you know, the good people can get out of the rural areas and the bad people will be left behind or something.
Well, I think a lot of the way that we get that is not only on Twitter, but like we're just inundated with it in media and TV. The story is always going to the city, you know, like Sweet Home Alabama. You know, that's a really old Reese Witherspoon movie, but
This is like Stone Age.
That was the narrative. But there's also this sort of reverse romancing of the rural. So in Sweet Home Alabama, I don't know why I'm talking about this movie, but it's a fantastic movie. But she goes to the city.
Should have won all the Oscars.
You know, she goes to the city and she becomes very disenchanted with it, and she's always dreaming. Like she goes back and she's sort of at first she's angry at being back in the rural area, and then there's the values. So I think that sort of like cultural argument that the values are in the rural areas and the city is, you know, cutthroat is just so deeply ingrained in our media that in like popular media, in consumed media, that it's created this sort of belief that it's real, even though, I mean, there are places in the city that are just, you know, as culturally conservative as places in the rural area. So I'm starting to go towards Keith's side on this.
Well, I think like
what's my side?
That there is no rural.
Well, see, I think there is a divide. Like, I think there is like a distinct like cultural and demographic in like I think even like racial and religious difference between rural areas and urban. But I feel like just the way people talk about it is they just kind of abuse that divide for their own purposes, which I mostly think, as we've said, like bullshit. But I don't think that means that there isn't like a distinct difference between those areas that's you have to recognize if you want to reconcile what's happening in the country right now.
Right, and they can be like basic economic analysis. So like farming, that we don't.
Exactly.
Farming
well, like okay, so like the yeoman farmer that you bring up.
Well, like because that's like
economic self-determination.
Yeah, that's like the Jeffersonian image of America.
Right. Yeah, I mean that makes sense, and I think like there's some truth to that, but I was also like, I don't know, I'm really into these teacher strikes, right? The history of collectivism in these urban and rural areas is and similar in some ways. Like I just had to read this huge book on the IWW last week for my comps. Yeah.
So for layman listeners, just briefly explain what that is.
Like one of the most successful like radical groups in the history of the United States, right? A group that tried to
International Workers of the World.
Yeah, like tries to organize all workers regardless of class, race, gender under one union, right? And successfully organizes, you know, hundreds of thousands of people across the United States. But the interesting thing is that the IWW starts where?
Like
Idaho.
Oh, it does?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought I was going to say Colorado.
Coeur d'Alene.
Oh, man.
Coeur d'Alene.
Yeah, I've been to
Like,
Coeur d'Alene, yeah.
My friend just
Were they
moved
loggers? Were they like...
They were miners.
Miners, nice.
So it's like Colorado and Idaho that start the IWW. And like the same thing with like somewhere like West Virginia, right? The history of the United Mine Workers, right? I told this to my students, right? The term redneck comes from this strike in West Virginia.
Because they all wore red bands.
They wore red band. I mean, I think that's really incredible, right? So this idea that sort of people are these self-independent yeoman farmers, if we look back at the history, right? Not so much, right? There's a history of collectivism.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But I think it's weird, right? Because like, I agree with you, Keith, right? Maybe the idealistic image of the founders was like, we're all going to be like independent farmers, these yeomen, out on the frontier or whatever, right? And we'll establish this beautiful kind of commonwealth and whatever. And then, of course, as things industrialize, you get like all these like people who are working shitty jobs, and they're like, you know, usually like immigrants themselves who are like, what the hell?
Yeah.
So you see radical collectivization. And I think, right, America's like one of the most violent like labor or one of the sites of like the most violent labor like conflicts in the world is like the U.S. in like the early 20th century. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But I think what's happened though is that, I mean, we can go back a lot of ways, but I think what's happened is that since, we in the United States started kind of offshoring industry.
Right.
Right. Because I think a lot of industries wised up and they're like, we can't compete with the working class in the United States. So let's go exploit all these people in China, and the Chinese government's like, hell yeah, give us your industrial capacity, win-win for everybody. But the little guy gets screwed. But I think what's happened then is like these rural areas where there aren't like mining jobs anymore. There aren't those kinds of right. So like jobs like that we think of like if we think of like a working class now, they are going to be more in a rural like a city area, right? They're going to be like retail workers or something, right? Those are like there's like what more people work for Walmart than like are coal miners now or something like that. It's just something ridiculous, right? And so I think just the way in which the labor market has changed has really affected then how people in these rural areas like think about the world, because obviously that's like a trope, is right, these deindustrialized areas are like hopeless, they've been destroyed by free trade and blah blah blah, and they're like this is like J.D. Vance's argument, right? But this is also then bred a culture of poverty, so they get hooked on opioids and whatnot.
So J.D. Vance, for those who don't know, he wrote Hillbilly Elegy.
Well, yeah. So J.D. Vance, when did it come out? Like 2015, 2016?
Yeah,
I think right after Trump was elected, and it's called this book called Hillbilly Elegy, like a memoir of a family and culture in crisis. And he's from Ohio. What's the city in Ohio? Somewhere in like central Ohio. And it's interesting, right? Again, talking about changes in labor, because he's from like a family from the South, like Kentucky. And we often talk about like the Great Migration in like the late 19th, early 20th century as like the movement of black people from the South up to the North for like jobs, also fleeing like, racial terrorism. But there's also, at the same time, there's also a concurrent Great Migration of poor rural whites moving north for jobs.
Also west.
In west, yeah. And so it's like basically a migration of just like poor people in general from the South outward. And so J.D. Vance talks about how he comes from this like southern redneck hillbilly background, and how his family comes from like multi-generational poverty, couldn't get jobs, multiple drug problems, the whole nine yards. And so his is like it's kind of a combination of like Horatio Alger and like William Julius Wilson almost, where he's like, I made it out. Because when he gets out there, he like goes to and joins the Marines. He goes to Yale, I think, or one of like a really fancy law school. And now he's like wrote this book, and now he's like a multimillionaire and set for life because it sold like a gajillion copies. But he has this like analysis that like what's happening is like predominantly he's focusing on like white rural America. It's just been ravaged by these economic changes, but then also that it's like people's kind of their own fault because they're bred into like a culture of poverty and they're not willing to work hard enough. But again, it's kind of almost a mirror image of that more liberal, like meritocratic view of like rural poverty. Is like if you can, you can get out of it if you really want to, or something.
Right, and I don't like. So first of all, I think people should read the book. It's
an interesting book. I enjoyed it. It's well written. I don't agree with it politically, but it is a book worth reading.
But I think this is part of what I was talking about, the narrative where like I'm leaving the rural area and I'm going to the city. See, I have the benefit of reading a lot of Quakers, and Quakers give you the exact opposite. They don't want to build their places, their meeting houses in the city. They want to build them in the rural areas. And certainly, before, and certain branches of Quakerism vary, obviously. But what happens with them is their sort of destination is the rural area. So the best Quaker schools are outside of the cities.
And that's because it's like the rural area is like pure and noble.
And that's what I'm saying. So the Quakers have turned this narrative upside down. So for them, it's always leaving the city. And if you're in the city, you're doing it to do good works and to help the city, because for them, the city is corrupt. And the city is where the vices are. And the city is where the prisons are. Whereas if you're a Quaker, and this goes with all the peace churches, so Mennonites, and basically Anabaptists, Brethren, they're getting outside of the city and they're creating families, and they don't have this sort of
But that's kind of happening now with like I think of certain types of like American conservatives, is that they're like, we just need to kind of drop out of like mainstream American society in general. Like you guys have been following this guy, what's his name? He Rod Dreher or something. He wrote this book called The Benedict Option, and he's like a crazy like hardcore like Christian conservative. Like he's not just Catholic, he's like Orthodox. Like he's all out, right? And he's like said this image of like American culture is like totally corrupted by secularism, and so Christians should stop being like evangelicals who are trying to like change the culture. They should just drop out of society and like form their own communes out in like the middle of nowhere, right? Like they like the Benedict option of like forming like your own kind of like self-sufficient Christian communities or something. Again, kind of this replay almost of like leave the city because the liberals have won or something, like in the urban area.
And it sounds like a, replay of the hippies, communes, like from the right perspective or something, right?
Man, right-wing hippies?
Right-wing communization, I guess, or something. I mean, they're not forming communes, but it's the same idea.
Kind of.
Yeah.
They just don't want to, they would never say that because they're like, we have nothing to do with those people.
Right.
This also kind of brings up, so I'll bring back the schools. What I was thinking of when you said this, in these red states are where the teacher strikes are happening. And I was also hearing someone I just told me that a friend of theirs just joined Teach for America. And Teach for America places kids in high need districts, right? But this placement was in Hawaii. And you're thinking, Hawaii, well, that sounds like a great place to teach, but the way the teachers are paid, but it's almost sort of that reverse, like where conservatives are creating the collectivization, because all of these conservative states have made the teacher pay so low that they're really encouraging the growth of unions because they're not going to stand for it.
Yeah. No, I think what happened is really, after kind of just Republican legislation that gutted, just like the welfare state in general, and then the deindustrialization of America. I mean, I think you just saw this flip side where the culture and the economy became, I guess, much more of like, how do I put it, other than like the creative class, Richard Florida style of like the people, when you think about people who work in cities, you don't necessarily even think of like factories anymore, right? You're thinking more of like professional jobs. Like, are you a lawyer? Are you a banker? Are you a teacher? Are you like a PR person? Are you a computer programmer? Like
Twitter.
Yeah, something like that. Like, we don't usually think of city jobs anymore as like, well, I'm off to the button factory. And so I think that has also kind of created this, and also of course those jobs require you to be very highly educated usually.
Right.
And so I think that has contributed, like this labor change has made it so it's like perceived as, people who work in the city now are perceived as, like more cultured, more cosmopolitan, more educated.
Who perceives them that way?
I mean, they do. Themselves do. Right? I think, and then they run policy, which is sort of like, so it creates like this nasty feedback loop. And so then it's no surprise that like people, like teachers are striking because they've kind of been like left high and dry.
Yeah.
Because lots of liberal policies get focused on the urban area because it's concerning like themselves and their interests.
Right.
And then Republicans have kind of in the midst of that taken over the legislatures of more predominantly rural states. And so, if you're people who work in those states can't help but, as we've been talking about, go towards like collectivizing in unions because they don't have any other route.
Well, like, I think that, like, part of the reason why I think the urban-rural divide is kind of bullshit, right, is because, like, I mean, go back to J.D. Vance, right? Like, people like Daniel Patrick Moynihan use that same argument to talk about African Americans in the inner city,
family?
Right?
Was that the
exactly. It's the same argument about the culture of poverty, right? And like, there are people in the inner cities who like obviously their lives have been messed up by the same sort of forces that have messed up, right? People in the inner city or in the Appalachia, Ohio, the places that J.D. Vance is coming from, right? So like, I mean, there's a federal disinvestment in and corporate disinvestment in the inner city as well, right? And we see, right, in response to that, also like a couple days ago, right, the Philly Tenants Union organized all these people who are getting displaced from this big sort of housing project in West Philly, right? And people joined this tenants union to collectively organize in response to that, right? The kind of disinvestment in programs for poor people as well. So like, I think that sort of the problems, right, facing the people in rural America and urban America in terms of class are very similar.
Yeah,
right?
I definitely would agree with you there. I still think that there are like cultural differences which are important, or at least like contextual differences that you can't ignore in terms of like, I'm just thinking in terms of like how I grew up.
Yeah.
Like in very rural areas, is that you just have to take into account that like most people in very rural areas in this country, like it's like overwhelmingly white, right? And I think it's just like in terms of like how then they perceive, like for instance, growing up in Burley or something, like other Grants or Fredonia, like you see on the stage a lot of these big topics about like, what are we going to do in Chicago? What are we going to do about like this legislature and this legislature? And that's all fine and good. lots of people in these areas are going to be like, this has nothing to do with me, right? Like they're not perceiving themselves like just the sense of like that they share a common bond with people in like New York City. If you're living in like Burley, is kind of hard at times to make, because if you live in a rural area like that, in say southern Idaho, I mean, you have to drive like 2 hours to get to like a big city, like a real big city at minimum, right? And like your own problems are going to be much more focused on like the agricultural industry, which no one seems to be talking about on a national level. Is like, well, what about farmers' subsidy rights, or what about like processing rights, or what about like like laws governing dairy, or like laws governing like migrant workers, right? And so I think a lot of those issues do create a kind of sensibility in certain like parts of rural America, predominantly, especially like agricultural rural America, is like these people in these big cities, right, don't care about us because. And then, of course, they would like you see those stickers all the time that say "with no farmers, no food." Well, and I think this is not something I want to say is like, I don't want to like make these people sound like the conservatives are right or something, but more like I understand why, and there definitely are people in these rural areas who feel like they're not noticed on a national level, and that they feel like that they do in part determine the structure of the society because they grow the food, right? And so I think there is a sensibility. And right, just growing up talking to like conservative people in like rural areas, there's just a sense of like, we are like the people that determine how this thing runs, or like we out here grow the food and everything, and without us, right, these big cities wouldn't have any kind of like material foundation to stand on or something.
You've reached the halfway point of this week's Hour of History podcast. Just wanted to remind you all to support us by subscribing and sending us your likes and comments at hourofhistory.com or on our YouTube channel. We want to thank you again for listening, and now the second half of this week's Hour of History podcast.
So I think that does contribute to a sense of like some people in rural America being, I guess, sort of ignored or cheated or something.
Yeah.
If I'm playing devil's advocate. But at the same time, right,
well, okay, so I hear all that, but I've seen all that in my experience as well. You love when I do this because I do it every episode, but I voted for a high-speed train in California. I know. No, but the things you see about the high-speed train is they don't want them to go through their farms in Central California. Yeah. Now, I think that's going to be a thing of the past because of the digital sort of bringing together. So there's digital bridging that can happen. The digital divide is not based on urban-rural. In fact, there's a lot of urban areas that don't have access to sort of digital technology that rural areas do. And I think the power of digital technology and sort of the power of the meme wars have elevated the political purchasing power of the rural areas.
That's a good idea.
It's like the rural areas now have a full armory of weapons that they can use, and the urban areas, the ones who would typically be able to mobilize voters and things like that, are not digitally. Like we had at a school I taught at, we had a day of code in New York City, and none of the computers worked because the Wi-Fi went out.
But is that more an argument that like that's because cities aren't investing in their infrastructure and building like internet, infrastructure, building,
well, they face a more unique challenge. So like Amazon can deliver a package by a drone to someone in rural California with no problem, but in a city there's a million more things you have to think about while having drones fly around.
Yeah. So that's interesting, right? So you're saying like a digital society is actually more partial to like being also at the same time a rural society?
Yeah, I'm saying that it's sort of even another like wedge is going
digital
into
yeomanship, digital communism.
Right. And then I can use this in my play into China. In China, you see this enormously where the digital rural divide is even more exaggerated. So like Mathias talked about how jobs are being offshored to China. All those jobs are going to coastal China. Yeah. So all the people in rural Western China.
This is why I'm skeptical of people who, even though I've said that my grandchildren will speak Mandarin. I've said that. But like this is also partly why I'm also skeptical of people who say China's going to conquer the world, because it's like China's got serious issues within its own country. Right, yeah, because you're right. The East Coast cities are huge and massive, and that's what everyone thinks about when they think about China. But it's like, man, there are like the vast majority of the population is living in like the rural western and southern portions of the country, which are like, that's a totally different ballgame.
On like less than a few dollars a day.
Yeah, and they're living in like areas where like bad infrastructure, it's hard to get around.
And it wasn't played on the news too much, but when Donald Trump first visited Xi Jinping, his granddaughter sang to Xi Jinping in Chinese. She already speaks Mandarin.
Yeah.
She's like 6 years old.
I saw
yeah,
that.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's like the hip Silicon Valley thing, right? The elite thing is like space communism only for the rich and learn Mandarin.
Well, but see, that's the kind of thing. Silicon Valley is sort of the new urban, right? Because if we're gonna follow this, Keith, you don't seem to buy into these.
Silicon Valley is the new urban.
What do you what do you mean by that?
In the way, the new divide is now technological versus backwards. If the so
you can't eat the internet though.
I agree with you. I don't. The value argument is like absolutely good, but
I mean, I think like that makes sense. Like maybe we should just get rid of the urban-rural divide and go with like
start talking tech versus
non-tech. I mean, that seems like a big divide to me, right?
Because there's whole areas in Philly that aren't connected to the internet very well right now.
Yeah.
Like what's the internet access and also just access like a computer, say someone living in like North Kensington?
Yeah.
Not very good.
Probably not probably similar to that of like a place like West Virginia or something even worse maybe. Who knows? Yeah, and that's something that's not really being talked about. And like even if we talk about these problems that are typically portrayed as rural problems like the opioids, I mean you see them in Kensington too.
Yeah, they're
everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think that might be closing in some ways. In other ways, like the farming, so we need fewer and fewer farmers as technology increases. Like that's just the way it's gone for the last so many years. We still need farmers, but there's less farming jobs.
Or the jobs that they're given to like illegal migrant labor.
Right.
Right, because that's what I noticed a lot in Burley, which is a huge agricultural hub, is that you have like one farmer and he's white, like almost 99% of the time. Or, funnily enough, he was maybe like one of my neighbors down the road. He was like of Japanese descent, but he was like descended from like one of the Japanese who had been detained out in southern Idaho, right? But like, and so. So you have like one head farmer, right, and he owns the land and it's his operation, but then he like subcontracts out maybe to like smaller folks underneath him, and he maybe has like 2 or 3 monster tractors that when you got to plant, you got to harvest, you're on like 48 hours drinking, because they're all Mormon too, they're all drinking nothing but Mountain Dew because they can drink that and have coffee. But then, right, the army of labor that actually gets shit done on the farm is they're people from like Mexico or Central America, right? That's the dirty secret of agriculture, is like you couldn't make it work. It wouldn't be farming is not profitable as it is now in America. That's why it's all subsidized. But like it really wouldn't be profitable if you had to pay people like actual wages as like if you were like a citizen or something. And that's why they can like give these people like bare bones wages in exchange for like them living in like shitty housing or something and not reporting them to like ICE or something.
Is that not the same, minus the legality of citizenship, is that not the same as like the intern structure in cities? Like you get an unpaid intern who has to somehow support themselves in say New York City without making money or making hardly
maybe in like a similar, right, or like that you're saying kind of the economy is running on fumes of like unpaid labor.
I'm saying these, we've built feudal triangles everywhere.
I mean, I would say it's definitely, I don't know. I mean, I push back against that because it's like, man, if you're like in your mid-20s and you're from like Mexico, like southern Mexico, and you don't speak English very well, if at all, and you're just like working your ass off like 12 hours a day to like send money back to like your abuelita back home, like your struggle is a lot more intense, I would say, than like some dude who like or anybody, right, who like went to Harvard and is now doing an unpaid internship in like Manhattan. Like, yeah, sure, they're both being exploited, but like, come on, there's a difference.
At least you can like apply for food stamps or something if you're. I mean, can you apply for food stamps
absolutely.
if you're
absolutely. Well, in states like California, you can't.
Not in Idaho.
Not in Idaho. I mean, well, the reason I said like the way I always thought of Visalia, right, is that Visalia is in the Central Valley, which is the fucking center of agriculture in the United States, right? Yeah. That's where the majority of food is grown for the whole country, right? And like that is absolutely, that place is fueled on undocumented labor, right? I don't know. So what was your experience of that? Because I know that it is it's a conservative part of the state, but it's also
But the economy is based on they want to build a wall and deport people, but it's man, your whole
economy is based on undocumented.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
we're also I would also say it's different as far as the head farmer is not always a white guy. There's the Portuguese and Mexican immigrants who would not be getting jobs in cities are very successful farming out in California. As far as the undocumented labor force, absolutely. There's entire cities and towns. I don't know, there was just one that went viral on Twitter of a girl in Porterville, California, wearing her prom dress, and her dad, who runs a little taco store, starts crying. He's so happy to see her in a dress. And so these kind of towns exist all over Central California. And they understand that they have to use that, but at the same time there's this not in my backyard type thing. So there's towns like Visalia, which is relatively well developed, and the people in Visalia are typically people who own their houses, compared to smaller towns like Kingsburg and Selma, and I should get called out by the Californian people for getting these things wrong, but the Mexicans and the undocumented laborers live in those towns, and it's sort of as long as they're in those towns, that's fine, they can do whatever. But I'm gonna live in my own city, so it's a total separation state.
Well, it's kind of it's like a segregation,
but also to bring in something
agricultural apartheid.
well, but at the same time, it's almost okay. You could say agricultural apartheid as far as the separateness, right? That's what apartheid means. But at the same time, the people are willingly coming to California to work these jobs. Because it's better than what's ever in Mexico, so there's that sort of thing too. So there's a constant flow of people still
I
trying
guess it's
to
all intersected, because in a way it's I've talked about this before on the show, right, about how a lot of the conservative talking points of being critical of NAFTA and free trade and deindustrialization and all of that are really arguments that the left was making a couple decades or more prior, right? Because Keith, you know a lot more about this than I do, right? But the working class is saying look, man, all these free trade agreements are going to screw over people with the working class, because they're going to lose all their jobs and you're not going to provide for them. And so it seems what's happened in the middle of this is that in American society, at least, so we did all these free trade agreements, we offshored everything, and that's crushed the working class, that's crushed unions in America. But then we have this realization, crap, we still need people to do these dirty jobs. You still need people to do these blue collar jobs, but we've destroyed our infrastructure to such a degree of allowing some sort of labor market for that to exist. So it becomes almost it becomes a black market of illegal quote unquote in finger quotes, right, or air quotes, of migrant labor, because it's people who are undocumented, who are not citizens, who are willing to fill in the gap, because these farmers are not going to hire somebody like me. They would never hire me, even if I was I want to work on your farm and I'll work. They're not going to hire me because they know that they can pay this other person less, and also they know that they can cheat that person more.
Right. I mean, sorry.
And so I'll wrap up in just a sec. Yeah. So that means that all these conservative talking points now of cut these deals and bring the jobs back. It's that's fine, but that also means is you're also sort of making kind of implicitly is that also means a lot more white people are going to be working shittier jobs. And are white people willing to do that?
I mean, they've never been willing to do those jobs. Right?
So in a way, it's almost these you can make those agreements and bring the jobs back theoretically, but that's going to mean you're going to have to then deal with the eternal problem of organized labor and unions again. You're going to go back to dealing with a more robust working class. Right. Than you had prior, which was what you had back in the up until all this happened.
But just to poke some holes in that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's absolutely true, and right, the history of NAFTA is that always unions were against it. But at the same time, the big thing about Cesar Chavez, right, was that he was trying to organize the agricultural workers, right? The history of of unionization in agriculture, right, was that agricultural workers, much like domestic workers, were excluded from the Wagner Act, right? So the thing about, right, the history of unionization in agriculture, right, is that because of, right, the exclusion of workers from basically, right, agriculture has always been an industry, right, if we look at it, right, that has relied on these low-wage workers, right? The 24 Immigration Act, right, that kind of put, what was it like? They put percentages on
significant quotas
on the people that could come, right?
If you were from, like, it was sort of like what Trump says. If you were from Norway, a lot, 1,000% of the population,
right? Exactly. And Jeff Sessions, right, importantly, right, praises that act, right? He says that was what we should return to. But right, Mexico was not impacted by that act, right? Because the agriculturalists wanted low-wage Mexican workers to come in and work for them, right? The Wagner Act was not applied to agricultural workers, because if agricultural workers unionized, right, that would bring the wages up. That would mean that sort of it would threaten, right, the profitability of agriculture, right? So in some ways, right, white workers in the Central Valley and in, I don't know Burley as well, but like basically, right, agriculture has been set up where it's like since the Mexican Revolution, essentially, right, has been reliant on these low-wage, undocumented workers.
What's interesting, just as to follow this sort of train of thought, is relative to my research. So California has been successful in its agricultural business, and you look at other places like the American South have not been as successful. And so you see, like, post-slavery, Mississippi brings in a lot of Chinese coolies. They try a lot of things the Spanish Empire did, actually, and they're not wildly successful with it, and then there's the Chinese Exclusion Act, because at the same time, they hate the people who they're getting to work. But that all aside, the research I do, a lot of Jews were leaving at the beginning of World War II, and that was one of the exemptions. If you could prove you were an agricultural worker and you could be a good farmer in the United States, they would let you come in if you were a Jewish German. But the problem was there weren't enough farms to sort of like sign off on them. So I have these letters that the Quakers wrote. They wrote to agricultural colleges saying, will you sponsor this person? And I read this haunting letter from Mississippi State University that said, oh, it sounds like you have some fine Jewish boys, but we're really looking for Norwegian and Swedish farmers. Wow. And I'm thinking, wait, so this guy in Mississippi is sitting there at the University, or Mississippi State, it was actually. So Mississippi State, he's sitting there in, Starkville, in his office, it's probably 1,000,000 degrees, just writing, we really need some Nordic farmers. Where is this?
Well, it's funny, brain? These, debates, they're kind of eternal almost. The more things change, the more they stay the same, right, in terms of, who do we want to come into the country, and who's going to get what jobs, and what jobs are going to exist.
Right.
And I think all of that, going back to our point about the urban-rural divide, is I think it's just because it's
that's what we were talking about.
We're sorry, back to the point. But I mean, it's because the urban-rural divide has become a really good, almost a kind of a hook that people can pin a lot of these issues around in a way, kind of maybe distort them or try and clarify them. But it becomes a way of people trying to think through this issue. Is if you live in a non-urban area, what does that mean about the jobs you have? What does that mean about your race? What does that mean about your status in society, right? And how does this work? And I think a lot of what we've been talking about agricultural workers is there's this weird divide and kind of, I guess, what we could call this conservative Republican fetishization of rural America, is that sure, on the one hand you want this beautiful white yeoman farmer ideal where everyone's a Protestant and they're all working on their family farm and everything's great and hunky-dory, right. And you have these family values and blah, 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 blah. But on the one hand, the only way you can create that kind of economy again is if you basically just destroy the economy as it exists now, which would mean total chaos for their own control of legislatures and power. Right?
Wait, I'm not following. Why do they have to destroy the economy?
Well, because we're talking about the digital initiatives. We're talking about the internet. We're talking about the new kind of jobs of the future. Is this weird kind of Richard Florida type creative class thing of young professionals. I'm using him as a trope, right?
I like how you always say weird, then Richard Florida.
Yeah. But anyways,
sorry, Richard Florida.
Sorry, Richard Florida. Well, your book's weird. It's weird. But so I think it's on the one hand, right? You can't. Right, unless you go full, I guess what we were calling it, digital communism or something.
Yeah, digital communism. What is that?
I don't know, right. But in terms of you can't build the kind of white yeoman ideal that you want while still supporting a kind of free market capitalism that causes these changes in the economy. And so if you want to build your white yeoman ideal, you almost kind of have to destroy the capitalism or the economy as we know it to get back to that vision. Right? Which is why I think, honestly, this is why you saw a lot of like disparate folks you wouldn't necessarily think of glom onto Trump, right? Like conservatives, like typical conservatives, but then you have like weird people on like the libertarian side of things who, sure, they're for like the free market, but they also want to preserve like, you know, certain kind of racial dominances. And you see all these weird arguments of like people on the left who would be like, actually, that's a good point about NAFTA, you know? And you would see, because it's sort of this cutting to the heart of it of saying, look, you can't as a conservative hold that you want to preserve this kind of like white, rural Protestant ideal while also supporting an economic system that is just inherently destructive, right? Creative destruction or non-creative destruction, but it's destructive either way in terms of like, it's always searching for new markets and it's always searching for a profit. And that is not something that you can hold on to if you're trying to conserve something.
Well, but I think this is interesting too. When you're doing this, I'm also thinking of these new, like, not the techno city or not the Silicon Valley. Yeah. I'm thinking of the new inner city. So like the people who are walking around downtown Brooklyn, for all intents and purposes, they are everything you just described, except not going towards rural. So like they're an urban version of all of that, because they're all either, you know, white or Asian. They're all working in like big ticket jobs like finance and things like that. So they're just hyper capitalists, but living in these like sort of secluded castles.
But this is something I've thought about. Is I feel like, and this is gonna sound really weird, you can tear me apart after this, is like I feel like certain visions of like libertarian capitalism and communism actually have certain similarities if you take them to their logical conclusion. In terms of like, I think with communism, right?
Utopia?
Well, they're both utopian, right? They're both absolutely utopian, but they're both like in the sense of like this ideal is if you can develop the economy enough, you will develop a kind of self-sufficiency of a community, right? Like in communism, right? You're literally creating a community, a commune of people. You all work together. You all put in what you need. You all take out what you need. And it creates this kind of self-sufficiency within the community. But if you look at a lot of like libertarian writings, especially some of the more wackier ones, they're all about like, man, if we can just create this like supermarket economy, we'll just be able to establish these like self-sufficient communities where everyone can just work really hard, and the market that everyone's creating through their work will just give them everything they need. And it sort of ends up being like, so what, that sounds kind of like a commune, and they'll be like, no. And I'm like, but that's kind of like these like self-sufficient communities based on like, that's sort of like with internal markets. It's like that sort of sounds like a commune to me.
Right.
And so I see like maybe in a sense, right, Brooklyn, it's like they can be super capitalistic, but they're sort of ending up creating this really communal society almost.
Yeah. Well,
but you can tear me apart. I realize that's a weird thought.
No, I mean I don't know. I mean, I haven't read enough about libertarianism to know if that's true or not, but like I would feel like the thing about creating the commune and like these people coming in with their libertarian mindsets is that like only people with money can participate in the sort of the commune, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And well, that's kind of like I was really actually happy. I know you said we were off topic, but I was really happy that our urban-rural divide discussion in America went global, because I think it has to, because considering how much
global
we're
trends.
putting on China, and not just China, but the developing
India.
world, the global South.
Yeah.
Like, okay, even if the U.S., and there's a lot of talk now that the U.S., universal basic income.
Yeah.
UBI.
Yeah, and, right now it's still a talking point. And Cory Booker, he put forth a bill, and he's going to be talking at Temple's graduation.
Is he?
Yes.
Really? Wow.
Interesting.
That's
but you
wild.
look at what he took a wrecking ball to Newark School District with the money of Zuckerberg. So it's like, and no one cares about that. Oh, that happened.
Or he also gets a lot of money from Big Pharma.
Yeah. So
Ooh, sketchy.
ooh,
I don't know. Yeah, I mean,
he sounds a lot like Cuomo, but we're not going there.
we're not re-legislating old battles.
No, I mean, could talk about urban-rural, like keep
no,
going.
totally. But anyway, I just want to make it global because there is always going to be that. So should the U.S. come together and be like, okay, we can bridge this gap. We need to focus on the digital issue and give universal basic income, and it'll make these rural people happy. Then you have all these other nations who are not going to be happy because it's going to shoulder the burden.
Yeah, well, because so many countries are dependent on us, like offshoring our economy onto them, and that's how they make money. Like that's the thing is like, we're so rich. Like, it's funny when people are like, "Oh, America's so weak, we don't do anything for ourselves." And I'm like, no, the opposite is like we're like the aristocrat of the world. We're so rich we can just hire out servants to do everything for us. Right. You know, that's what it really means. It's not that we're like we've lost our capacity or anything.
And so like Trump talks about these, especially with the tariffs of China, he talks about like, you know, I'm going to bring steel jobs back to the United States. Okay, those steel workers are going to be happy. But you know what? When people have to pay $10,000 more to buy a car, Americans are probably going to be a little less happy. Like the tariffs that we've sort of levied against China are going to make... The other day, I lost this little piece, the little tiny rubber piece that goes on the earbud.
Right.
So my headphones are useless. Well, I go on Amazon and I buy a new pair for $5 and it works fine. If we start levying tariffs against China to bring our workers back up, we're not going to be able to get $5 headphones on. So that's the kind of like aristocrat. Like we feel we deserve headphones cheaply.
Well, I think Brian Simon, right, if you read his book about cheap, like would say that there's a price to that, right?
Yeah.
That is paid in sort of the safety that workers experience and the plants that are making those earbuds, right? In terms of, I guess he talks about food, right? But he talks about chicken nuggets, right? In terms of the kind of health that you're putting into your bodies, right? I mean, so like there's a price that comes with the cheap products, right?
Well, I think too, it's like, no.
Yeah.
I think what all this comes down to for me is like, we're living in an age of like such a huge economic transition that I think it's just hard for us to like grapple with. You could say that about the last 200 years. It's always been an age of transition. But I feel like particularly now, because the American economy is kind of damned if it does, damned if it doesn't right now. Like everything is cheap and affordable because we're offshoring things.
Yeah.
And that's great and awesome. But then the problem is, well, it's awesome for Americans, right? The problem is though that has also created problems within our own domestic economy of screwing over lots of workers and basically kind of creating what is essentially, right, a surplus population of workers who the economy can't really provide for. Or jobs that are like, we talk a lot about how like, yeah, there's like full employment-ish right now, or there's like unemployment's really low, but it's like the kind of jobs people are working are, you know, they're not good jobs. They're
Nor
like,
are they going to exist in
yeah,
10
and
years.
they're not going to exist. It's like retail. It's like, you know, or just really shitty jobs. Like no one wants to work like, you know, like job, like warehouse jobs in Amazon where like they like the light tracks you as you walk because it's to save like electricity costs and they just like crush your soul. Like
work
those
like 12-hour days.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think so. It's like for me, it's like it's not just that. Like so, what we've done is create such changes in our economy that like things are cheap, but then we've also created a society where like the amount of money going around is not much because we've sort of destroyed our own domestic working class. And so it's sort of like, yeah, we can, and so yeah, you could go the route of let's bring everything back, but then prices are going to rise, but then you will have quote unquote like more jobs and better jobs. But at the same time,
such a temporary fix.
It's a temporary fix because automation is going to crush everything, which I guess is where I polemically think that in a way, I embrace something that I don't know if you guys heard. It's called accelerationism. This is like we're going deep internet subculture here.
Nice.
But like something I've like looked into is like this idea that what we should do is try to accelerate this kind of capitalist process of the digital economy and automation because that's how we're going to create the kind of foundation where we're just be like, well, there are no jobs anymore because it's all being automated. So then we can actually dismantle or end an economic system based on a job market, which basically means the end of capitalism, and you can have a kind of self-sufficient economy on renewable energy and automation. That's a whole different can of worms of like who has the copyright laws, who owns the machines.
I have a couple things about that.
But I feel like we're sort of caught in like the dilemmas of the insufficiencies of a market where you have to compete for a job, but then we're always trying to get to the bottom, to the lowest price, and that's creating these internal contradictions.
Yeah, and I think those are all good points, and I think you know, corrupt as Cory Booker may be, he's at least trying to legislate for the future, and that might be because he's under 80 years old. I have nothing against 80-year-olds.
But did you see Dianne Feinstein just said like, actually, recreational marijuana is okay.
Oh, yeah, she finally had a change of heart at age 86.
All right, Dianne Feinstein.
But anyway, so so maybe because he's one of the younger senators, but these kind of things like we need to start legislating for the future,
Yeah.
and at least because okay, you can bring back steel jobs. That's going to be good for a year until we figure out something else. And
and that's also too is like that's why this changing economy I think is going to really wipe out China because it's not ready for that kind of transition.
Well, that's the sort of thing that this is a problem that's like plagued these developing nations since they've been developing is they're always playing catch up. And if you play catch up along the same lines, like the same rules, you know, they're building these massive Silk Roads right now, you know, through Pakistan and stuff. And, you know, it might be China's underhanded way of just gaining ports. Like, they already have a port in Sri Lanka now because Sri Lanka defaulted on their loans. And they're going to get a port in Pakistan. So, like, they're getting bases. That might be the real reason they're doing this. Instead of building giant roads. Like, we don't need roads. I mean, what... It's sort of retroactive growth. China's building on old models. When I think for China and India, it's going to have to be... They're going to have to be the leaders because their problems, I think, are a little more severe. It's a lot easier for USA to go into protectionist mode and like sort of like you've seen like Europe and Switzerland. There should be a forthcoming episode on Switzerland and neutrality, how they've been able to survive, you know, untouched because of location. And Bhutan, home of world's highest gross national happiness. Just because they don't, you know, they're totally isolated. But I'm getting too far afield again.
Yeah.
Well, what I think the important thing is that those places, India and China, are going to have to sort of lead the innovation and sort of legislating for the future. And they might be better at doing it because they're not bogged down in these sort of like representative democracies filled with people who don't understand the future. So I think we might have to turn to those places.
What do you think?
Any final thoughts?
Let's turn to them. I'm into it. Yeah.
But I think But I still think that in America, we're gonna, I think, face a more deepening crisis of relationships between urban centers and rural areas because what jobs are being created are not going to be created in rural areas, or even like we're talking about like places that are kind of booming in the Midwest the way at the beginning, but those are not like what I would think of as a rural area. Those are still like cities, right? They're like 100,000 plus. Like true rural America, it seems inevitably is just going to die off.
Yeah.
For good or ill, because there's just no jobs there, or there might be large farms, but like the infrastructure around those farms is going to like dissipate because it's like no one is going to want to live there, and no one wants to necessarily work as like a shopkeeper to a farmer forever.
Well, I think it might not be that bleak for the rural areas. I think it might be different because I think people are becoming so disenchanted with cities and the way cities are being run that it's going to sort of be...
Or they create more egalitarian cities.
Back to the land type thing?
I think because the digital issue... why would you live in a cramped, tiny New York... It's Sweet Home, Alabama... all over.
If you're like a PR person, you can just work online from anywhere.
Yes.
Why not just work in like a beautiful ranch?
It's the digital nomads. I'm going to Costa Rica, Hour of History Studios. You can come with me if you want.
Digital nomads.
All right. Thanks for listening. It's been a fantastic.
We love you even if you live. No matter where you live, city, rural, somewhere in between.
And
shout out to the teachers on strike.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
The divide.
So, Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Andrew Cuomo.